So today we're talking about air. We've talked about it in the past, but it is really important, and I break it down into 4 main categories where we use air at Kaiser. So when we blast, we're using compressed air. When we blow parts off after pre-treatment to try to dry them off or get the puddled water off of them, we're using compressed air. When we spray powder, we're using compressed air. And when we liquid paint, depending on the type of equipment we're using, we could be using compressed air or we may not be. But in all those cases, it's extremely important to have the air clean and dry. It depends on what type of compressor that you're using to determine the type of filtration that you're going to need. So typically in a manufacturing environment where you're using a lot of air, it's pretty common to have a rotary screw compressor, which is what we have at Kaiser. But on smaller shops and even possibly large scale, you could have a reciprocating compressor. So the main difference between the two are how basically the compressor is designed and kind of how it makes air. So a reciprocating compressor is like a piston in a cylinder, and that's how it's compressing the air. There's not very much oil that gets introduced into the air during that type of air compressing process in a reciprocating compressor, but it gets very, very hot. So since you're getting really, really hot air, and then the air is going to end up cooling back down, you're going to have moisture issues. So with a reciprocating compressor, the main thing that you're concerned with is moisture. For a rotary screw, it's actually compressing the air with the screw. So in that situation, oil is mixed with air in a rotary screw compressor, and then the oil is supposed to be filtered out and separated before your air exits the compressor. But no matter what compressor you have, you're always going to have oil in your air coming out of a rotary screw compressor. So then filtration is very important because you need to make sure you get the oil out of the air. And water moisture is still an issue with the rotary screw, but usually the outlet temperatures of the air coming out of the compressor aren't quite as warm, but they're still pretty hot. So we've done a lot of trial and error over the years. Manufacturers can help point you in the right direction, but usually you kind of have to figure out what works best for you and your environment and how clean that you want the air. We use a combination of a lot of different filters and air dryers to get the air quality that we want. And I've kind of settled on a pretty good routine and system and maintenance routine for ourselves that works really, really well. But it's taken probably between 4 and 5 years adding things as we go, getting to the air quality that we have now, which is really, really good. And so if you have any questions about air quality, please leave some comments below, email us, ask us some questions. We can address some more in-depth questions on the podcast. But I would really happy to help and point you in the right direction and even get into a little more detail. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this video about all the brands and everything like that, but we'll kind of go over generally what you're going to want. So on a rotary screw compressor, so we already said that we're going to have oil in the air, and we probably need to get some moisture out of it to make sure that the air is dry. So you're going to need a filter, a coalescing filter that's going to help you get oil out. And then you're going to need an air dryer to dry that air. Some people call them a cooler. It's technically a dryer, but what it does is it's actually cooling the air way down and then getting moisture out of it. And so those are the 2 main components that coming out of a rotary screw compressor that you're going to need is some type of coalescing filter and then a dryer. Now there's a lot of different options out there for filters and dryers. All I can say is make sure that the most important thing is to size those pieces of equipment properly. So you need to know the CFM that your air compressor puts out and that you're going to be using. and make sure that the filter and dryer will meet your CFM needs. And don't forget to take into account just your environmental conditions. So where you're operating, if you're a mobile unit and you're operating outside, that's going to be different than being inside of a building, because you have to consider just environmental factors. How dusty is everything going to be? How hot or cold is the area around all of your equipment going to be? And you need to take that all into consideration. When it comes to a reciprocating compressor, we said earlier that there's really not that much oil that we need to worry about. There could be some, but it's not a lot. But the main thing is the air temperature coming out of that compressor is very, very hot, so you almost always have moisture issues. So that's your main concern. So there you're going to want a dryer to help get moisture out, and still some sort of filter. Usually out of a reciprocating compressor, a particulate filter might be good enough. I would still recommend getting maybe a low-grade coalescing filter, just so at least if there is any oil, you are knocking that out of it. But most importantly, it's going to be a dryer. Now, you're not going to need, usually a reciprocating compressor doesn't push near as many CFM as a rotary screw. You could get them to, a rotary screw to not have hardly any CFM, and a reciprocating compressor have a lot. It just depends on the size you buy, but in general, reciprocating compressors are used when it's a lower CFM demand, based on my experience, and then rotary screws are used when you need a lot of CFM demand. So your dryer is going to be smaller on a reciprocating. Some people might even kind of question you, like, why you even want a dryer coming off of that, but it is important. I would recommend going directly to, it's probably likely that where you get your reciprocating compressor from, they might not have dryers, so you probably need to go directly to a company that sells dryers to get that from them. And so just kind of the general setup, where you want filters in line and where you want the dryer. When you're coming out of your compressor, you're always going to want some kind of filter right when you come out of the compressor before you get to your dryer. That way you're catching any debris, or if it's a coalescing filter, you're catching oils, and you're getting most of that filtered out before you go through the dryer. That way you're not ruining that piece of equipment and fouling it out, is what we would call it. So then the dryer can't work as well as it's designed to. So you always want compressor, filter, dryer. And then usually, at least how we're set up on a rotary screw, after you come out of the dryer, you're going to go into a holding tank. Okay, so you should have clean, dry air in that holding tank. But usually I like to have a filter coming out of that tank, just because even when they're brand new, there could be debris and things in it. And I just like to make sure that if there's anything in that tank that ends up falling off in the long term, or just in there from the beginning, that gets filtered out. So we're going to have a compressor, filter, dryer, your tank, and then another filter. And that should get you pretty good. You should have some pretty good quality air. There's some other steps you can take to get even higher quality, but reach out to me and I can talk to you about that. It gets a little more sophisticated, and it really depends on your application. For the reciprocating compressor, going back to that, you're gonna have the compressor itself. You're gonna come out of that with usually a reciprocating compressor has a tank right with it. So it's making the air right there, and it's going right into the tank. So you don't have any option to filter usually right there, or have a dryer. So you have your tank right there. It comes out of the tank. You're going to hit a filter. Then you're going to have your dryer. And then from there, you probably can just go on and use that air. You don't necessarily need another filter, because hopefully the air that you're putting into the dryer is relatively clean. So that way you're not ruining your dryer. And so then coming out of the dryer, you should have good clean air. You could put another filter after if you wanted, but that could be overkill. Just depends on your application.